Project Ripcord, a Vietnam fire support base in 1/72nd scale. During the construction of the hill, we determined where the various hardscape items were located and how they were constructed. Most of the structures on Ripcord were built from 105 mm ammunition crates filled with earth, prefabricated timber frames, half-sections of corrugated culvert, and sandbags. Master patterns were scratch-built for the howitzer positions, bunkers, mortar pits, ammunition cans and crates, powder tubes, ammunition, and MCI boxes, which are meal, combat, individual, and are the successor to the C ration. These masters were then turned over to Stephen Reed of Celtic Model Works and Rebecca Hetmansberger of HQ72 Resins for casting. The castings were distributed to club members for painting and finishing. Mike Roof also learned Tinkercad and bought an Anycubic Photon DLP desktop 3D printer. He designed and printed the Conex containers for the Radio Research Unit and S4, offices, Mermite hot meal cans, the field refueling apparatus, flight line fire bottles, the radio direction finder done on the insistence of one of the museum staff. We later learned that that particular piece of equipment had been withdrawn from service in late 1969, generators and other one-off items. The more we made, the more we saw that needed to be made. Honestly, when you look at photos of Ripcord, areas on the hill looked like a third-world slum, with bunkers stacked upon each other, sandbags piled on top. The hardscape items were installed as soon as the foamwork was complete. Cavities were cut into the foam using knives and hot wire cutters, and the items, howitzer positions, mortar pits, bunkers, retaining walls, etc., were installed using either a bit of foam-safe adhesive or a generous blob of Durham's rock-hard water putty, mixed to the consistency of cookie dough. Any squeeze-out was shaped with putty knives and blended out into the foam substrate. The Durham's was smoothed with a wet finger, actually, wet fingers, and allowed to dry. We went back and forth on how to do the rest of the ground cover. Latex paint and latex concrete block filler were considered. The solution we decided upon was Durham's. Initial coats were made by mixing the Durham's with water until the consistency of a thick cake batter was achieved. This mixture was spread over the foam in a thin layer, smoothed with wet fingers, and allowed to dry. Once the first coat was dry, we applied a second coat of Durham's. Mixed to the consistency of peanut butter, this layer was also smoothed with wet fingers and allowed to dry completely. Any goofs, putty knife marks, ridges, and clumps were Durham's rock-hard water putty, by the way, is a gypsum-based powder that is sold as a filler material in most home centers. It is mixed with water, does not shrink, and, as the name implies, cures to a rock-hard consistency. The package recommends mixing it to a stiff consistency, but by using more or less water, the consistency can be varied from that of crepe batter to bread dough. This is handy, because thinner mixes can be poured while stiffer mixes can be spread and smoothed with a putty knife. As it cures, it reaches a phase where it can be carved like wet leather or bar soap. It can be textured by sprinkling dry powder on top of the wet layer. The dry powder absorbs the moisture from the wet layer and is bonded to the surface. We attempted to texture the Durham's while it was still wet by sprinkling additional dry Durham's powder through a tea strainer onto the surface, and it initially worked well. The result is quite realistic for dusty, dirty ground, but we found that it is also quite fragile. Even after a few days and a coat of paint, if you brushed against the surface, the dry powder rubs off, revealing the unpainted putty below. It becomes slightly more durable if you mist water over the surface, but it still rubbed off in spots. In response, we tried texturing the putty with a sand-textured Artist's Gel medium. This worked quite well, and we continued to use it around the various hardscape items on the top of the hill. However, like everything else about this project, we realized we would need a lot of the gel medium, and at $15 for an 8 Oz jar, well, the budget wouldn't be happy. During one of his resupply trips to the home center featuring orange shelves, Mike found a tub of pre-mixed grout. The tub said, acrylic, so, on a hunch, he bought it. After we started using it, we came to suspect that it was probably a product similar to the textured gel medium, and at a cost of $12 per quart, it was much more attractive. Other than the areas immediately around the firing positions and main HLZ, all the rest of the ground texture was done with the grout. Initially, we would apply a pile of grout and stipple it with a brush. We found it to be easier to mix the grout with water to thin it to about the consistency of a thick milkshake, and then stipple it onto the dirhams with a disposable bristle chip brush. The texture was finer and better distributed over the surface. The grout could also be used to build minor contours, as well. It was a lucky find, but one that we've all been impressed with. Once the dirhams and grout dried, the hill got a few coats of paint. The areas immediately around the hardscape items and most of the upper module were painted using a mix of Tamiya acrylics. So as not to spend a fortune on hobby paints, we did spray outs of our hobby paint mixes onto white card, took the cards to the home center and had them custom mix quarts of the base and 2 highlight colors. Once we cut in around the hardscape items with airbrushes, the rest of the hill was painted with an HVLP gun to save time and our sanity. To add more texture, we used a technique called slap molding. We crumpled heavy-duty aluminum foil, formed it into a mold, and filled the cavity with dirhams mixed to pancake batter consistency, and allowed it to partially cure. Once it was no longer runny, but before it was leathery, we slapped the molds onto areas of the hill and allowed the putty to further cure. Before it was totally dry, we peeled the foil off, leaving a nice, rocky outcropping on the hill. Any gaps and voids around the edges were filled with more dirhams. Additionally, we took the great stuff, boogers, the stuff that squeezed out of holes and such, and coated them in dirhams to make boulders. These boulders were added here and there around the outcroppings using a mixture of grout, acrylic gel medium, and water, mixed to the consistency of runny, partially thawed ice cream. One of the crew likened it to a Wendy's frosty dessert. The rocky outcroppings were later painted black, dry-brushed with gray, and a sponge chipping technique using greens added a mossy look to them. The next texture we added was tree stumps. This Firebase was situated on the top of a mountain that had been clear-cut, which meant there were a lot of stumps. Mike mastered a few different types and sizes of stumps and sent them to Stephen Reed for casting. A total of almost 2,000 stumps were cast, and as we received them from Stephen, they were given to Tim Dara for painting. Placing them randomly around the base was going to be difficult. As many of you know, the harder you try to be random, the more uniform the result. Matthew Goodman came up with an idea. He took a piece of poster board, set it on the ground, and dropped various items from about 3 feet. He then marked the locations of these items, and punched holes. This became a template, the random stumperator, patent pending, or not. Place it on the mountain and mark the holes with a Sharpie, and voila! You have random stump locations. A conscious effort was still required to mix up the various styles of stumps, but once we got going, it was relatively easy. The stumps were added to the hill using the mix of acrylic matte medium, grout, and water, and any squeeze out was blended out with a wet brush. The paint around the base of the stumps was touched up and highlights were added and allowed to dry. Now we have a mountain peppered with tree stumps. Logically, the rest of the trees should be here, too, right? I mean, it wasn't as if the U.S. Army had a thriving timber business on the side. The trunks and branches had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was down the mountain. In actuality, the trees were cut down by chainsaw or detonation cord by the engineers, hosed with a defoliant, and then burned. However, some of the timber would remain. To simulate this, we thought of several procedures, but the one we settled on sounds a bit strange. We chopped up twigs in a blender. A note for those trying to attempt the same. Be sure the household 6 knows what you're doing, or that you're using a spare blender. Other points of interest: use small, dry twigs. Anything larger than about 1/16 in diameter won't chop easily, and even damp wood doesn't cut cleanly. We made the slash in batches. Each batch would yield dust, or as we called it, scatter, tiny twigs or branches, and larger sticks or logs. We applied it to the base by first applying a mixture of white, PVA, glue and water. We initially used a spray bottle, but found it was easier to simply apply it with a brush. Then sprinkling the scatter. Larger logs were white glued randomly, and then the branches and smaller logs were sprinkled onto the base, and gravity did the rest and carried them down the cuts and draws where they came to rest. Another spritz of the PVA water mixture locked this into place, and then a mixture of various colors of commercially available ground foam, turf, and static grass was distributed over the area. We worked back and forth on any given area until we were convinced that it looked natural. The final layer of ground cover was done by using some of the chopped twigs that fell between the scatter and branches. I believe we called this sticky stuff, and it balanced out the look of the ground cover. Several places were given larger underbrush by using straight ground foam, foliage. Initially it was a bit bright, we later toned it down with a glaze coat of airbrushed ground color.